We're joined today by Dr Anthony Bergin, the Deputy Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Anthony, after the recent APEC meeting, you wrote an op-ed in which you highlighted Australia's middle power label. What prompted you to write that? Because isn't this really a bit arcane?
Yes, arcane to some extent, David. What prompted me was the fact that on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly at the end of September, there was a meeting of so-called middle power countries: Indonesia, Turkey, Mexico, Korea and Australia. And that grouping has now become known as MIKTA, after the first initial of each country, MIKTA. And you won't find anything about MIKTA on our Foreign Minister's website or the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade website. But if you go to the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you will find some material about this new grouping, international grouping called MIKTA. And I was intrigued, you know, why this group? It seems a somewhat bizarre group of countries. They met because they felt that they were all democracies and that they felt that they were middle powers that could contribute to global issues. Mexico agreed to be the chair for the next meeting. They would meet annually. It wouldn't be a permanent block, as it were. And it got me thinking, well, does the world really need MIKTA? Does Australia need MIKTA? And does it make sense for Australia to promote and advance its interests through this middle power label? So I thought it would be interesting just to look at some basic metrics of where Australia is ranked in the world. And my principal finding, I suppose, is that I think it's very misleading for Australia to present ourselves as a middle power. For example, we are the 12th largest economy in the world. We're about the 12th largest military, spending on military equipment. We are the 8th largest aid donor in the world. We are number 5 in terms of GDP per capita. In terms of our jurisdictional claim over the Earth's surface, we are the largest claimant state, if you include our Antarctic landmass, of which we claim 40% of the Antarctic continent. So I thought, gee, if we're middle, we're certainly upper middle. And, you know, presenting us as a middle power seemed to sell us short, and you know, sort of a bit of pop psychology about the role of the middle child. You know, the middle child is reportedly, you know, feels neglected and left out. And I thought, well, is this the image that we want to present to the world, that we feel somewhat bereft and left out, and, you know, have to have occasional tantrums to get attention to ourselves through this middle power label? So I looked around, what would you call it? I found a fantastic speech that former Foreign Minister Downer gave several years ago now. He talked about Australia as a significant country. I use the word, plagiarising it from a term that the Oxford Analytica, the global consulting company, have used, talking about pivotal powers. So I suppose, you know, long-winded way of saying what prompted me to write the article, and to throw some thoughts in on this, was this somewhat strange group meeting held on the margins of the United Nations.
Anthony, you mentioned a number of important metrics there, but there are other metrics where Australia is far from being a middle power, particularly of that size. So why do you think the Australian government adopts middle power as a label, and what advantages does it hold for us?
Well, it's a term that was originally coined by Doc Evatt in 1945 at the San Francisco conference. I think it has been a term that the Labor Party have been traditionally oriented to. It was certainly popularised by Gareth Evans when he was the Foreign Minister. And the utility, I suppose, has been seen to be that we've been able to link with a number of like-minded countries of roughly similar size to advance our interests. And certainly Australia has been a joiner when it comes to international groupings. You know, it's great to have a big Rolodex where you can make contacts around the world. And I guess MIKTA is another example of that. When you say what has been the utility of badging us in that way, I suppose it's allowed us to join coalitions. I guess it's demonstrated that we have some degree of independence from great powers. So I'm not saying that trying to tip a complete bucket of fertiliser on the concept, but I do think that it is potentially limiting, and it's not accurate. I mean, if you take, for example, the South Pacific, which is something like a quarter of the Earth's surface, Australia, I'd argue, on any metric, is a superpower. In the Indian Ocean, we're the largest claimant state of maritime jurisdiction in the Indian Ocean. So I'd say we're a major player. I think we're a major player in Southeast Asia. If you think about these things in hemispheric terms, you know, we're a top tier player in the Southern Hemisphere. So I think it's inaccurate, and I think it potentially limits our interests and ability to sort of play a creative role in global affairs by badging us as a middling country.
Because I did want to come to that, because there are costs associated with joining associations like MIKTA, and similarly there are potentially better ways for Australia to express its role in global politics. Can you maybe go into that a bit further, and what better ways could Australia further its profile, I suppose, in the global setting?
Look, I think, well, to answer your first question, David, on the costings, look, MIKTA probably won't be terribly cost resource intensive. You know, it's designed as an annual meeting, but I take your point if you're meaning that someone has to staff the meetings and so forth. So there will be some costs associated in terms of staff time, etc., I suppose, to support this new grouping. Look, I think Australia is already respected in global affairs. I mean, after all, at the moment we've got no shortage of countries wanting to talk to us because we're on the non-permanent member of the Security Council. But you know, Australia is respected in Europe, increasingly in Africa, in the Middle East, increasingly in Latin America. So I suppose my point is I'm not sure whether this new grouping is really going to add or confuse that respected image that we now have. Well, you know, you asked me what's the best way for Australia to present ourselves. I think the best way is that we're a country with global interests, that we're a top tier country, we're a pivotal country, if you like, in terms of shaping geopolitics in our near region. And I don't agree, for example, with this single-minded focus by defining our interests only in terms of Asia, you know, Australia in the Asian century. Well, it's also Australia in the African century, you know, arguably. You know, let's not ignore Africa, let's not ignore Europe. I think so. My concern is that if we get fixated on the middle power label, it potentially can diminish our capacity to, you know, advance our interests across a range of geographic areas.
Anthony, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts today. I hope you've enjoyed this short interview with Anthony, and you can read more of Anthony's work on ASPI's website and also on our blog, The Strategist. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, David.